Hi guys, Michael here again. Just going to do a video today talking about making a game, the process of making a game, and I guess a kind of a basic overview of how does someone make a game. Now I'm going to cover things like game design sort of theory, the scope of a game, and I'm also going to talk about the team that goes into making a game and their different roles. Now, with game design, it's important to understand that the design of a game is not just ideas surrounding a game. Now, you see a lot of people that go, I want to make a game. I want it to be like an open world sort of shooter thing. Now, there's going to be a plot line with your main character's dead sister has come back to life, and you're going to seek vengeance on those who wronged you in the past. Yeah, anyone want to work on that with me? That's not game design. That's a collection of ideas, like real basic sort of concepts, and that's got story elements mixed in with it as well. Game designers, when they're designing a game, they design I suppose you'd say they design the gameplay for a game before really tackling anything else. So they define like the interactions that a player will have within the game, the sort of win and lose conditions, and they nail down what sort of game they're making. So a game designer, if he's doing sort of his pitch for a game, it might be something more like this will be a single player first person shooter with a very simple aesthetic. The main hook of the game is that there is a time rewind mechanic that players can utilize to get around difficult sections of the game. The time rewind mechanic will be managed mainly through pickups that are awarded the further the player progresses in the game. And the primary challenge from the game comes from the overwhelmingly difficult enemies that require the player to make good use of that rewind mechanic in order to progress further in the game. That's really limited in what they're, much like that first example I gave, but they're talking about actual gameplay mechanics. Like you could say things in there as well, that there is no regenerating health, the player is limited to, or is not limited to picking up as many weapons as they like. All weapons are situational and will be used to defeat specific enemies in a rock, paper, scissors sort of formation. It's more about the actual game itself, the interactions in the game, rather than the overall grand concept of things, at least to start with. Now, when forming a concept, it's important when talking about games to actually be talking about the gameplay. Now, you can make some exceptions here in terms of like real artsy indie titles that are around these days that are sort of blurring the line between game and some sort of like interactive fiction. So you can talk about things like Dear Esther, as the design sort of brief for that wouldn't really contain too much in the way of gameplay, apart from saying, look, it's a first-person exploration game, you travel between different locations on an island, you are totally alone apart from the character, and the further you progress throughout the game, the more backstory you are delivered by a sort of invisible narrator. It's important when designing a game to compile all the design theory into a design document. I'll chuck something up on the screen here. The design document is a good way to make sure that everyone can get the information they need to get. It's a good way to get your ideas onto paper, so you're not just rambling on with all these different things that are in your head, and you're like, I want to do a game with it's got cars, and so you can get in the cars and drive them, but then you can also jump out the window. It's an open world, by the way, and that sort of thing doesn't work. So you want to nail it down to something really tight, especially when you want to pitch this to people that you want to work on your game with. Don't give them a giant exposition of backstory. Tell them what sort of game it is. And something that's really important with indie games is to think, when you're designing a game, think about scope. Now, scope is basically, what does your game encompass? You see lots of people on the internet that want to make a game, but they don't know anything about it. They'll go, I want to make an open world shooter that's a lot like GTA and different in only slight ways. If you're looking to make a giant open world game that encompasses an entire city, and you're driving around doing everything you do in GTA with little side missions and things like that, you're gonna need a massive team and a massive amount of time. That's why it takes them so long to make new GTA games or Saints Row games or anything like that. And that's why you don't see many indie games, successful indie games, coming out that do encompass such a large scope. Because the larger your scope is, the more time and the more people you'll require to complete it. Now, limiting scope doesn't mean that you're going to be making a short or a bad game, but it means you can have a more manageable game that you can actually reasonably accomplish. A good example of a small scope game, say you're going to make a game with yourself and your friend, that's it. You've never really made a game before, but you really want to make an RPG, like say a Japanese RPG, where you've got party members and you travel around. Instead of setting this across time and space and millions of different worlds like some big Final Fantasy adventure, consider you setting this game within a village or within a town. Now, lots of different things can happen within that town, and it could be quite a lengthy game, but in limiting your scope, initial scope like that, you have more chance of having a more compelling, tighter experience that actually gets finished. If you, say, even if you did finish that big, massive scope game, there's going to be a lot of empty levels in there and lots of blank space that aren't very engaging for the player, because you've had to sacrifice something if there's only two of you working on it to actually complete that within a reasonable time frame. This is putting aside working on it for 10 years or something like that. But say you wanted to have a game done within a year. There's 2 of you, you want to complete a commercial game within a year. Think of a narrow scope. So even if you're doing something like an RPG, something that's typically huge in scope, set it within your village. Lots of different things can happen in the game. It can still be a 6-hour, 8-hour game, but it's all centered around the one location. That location could change. Your village could get invaded, and then you fight enemies within the village, which was typically a safe area to start with. And there's all sorts of different things you can do. There's lots of games out there that are relatively small in scope that are excellent games. Now I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the different roles that you will see in like smaller indie game teams. Now, depending on how many people you have working on a game, you will often see team members taking on multiple roles. For example, on Longsword, you could say I'm the project lead, but I'm also the designer, the artist, and the programmer. That's because it's basically me working on it, apart from sound and music, and some other art. But you can say I'm the lead artist, and that's another artist. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Thinking about these roles is a really good way to sort of plan out how you actually want to make this game, especially if you're making it with a couple of friends and you've never made a game before. You should hopefully find this pretty useful. First role I'd like to talk about is the project lead. Now, the project lead is the sort of role that everyone wants to be. So, a lot of people think of the project lead as, I tell you what to do, you do it, and then a game gets made, and I can say, oh, that's my game because I was doing everything. Doesn't really work like that. A project lead, you can kind of think of them. I'm gonna use a couple of film analogies here because a lot of people know more about the process of making a film than they do of making a game, and there is a lot of overlap. There really is. All right, you can think of the project lead as almost like the producer. Now, the goal of the project lead is to make sure the game gets finished, and they do this by managing the team and the time, and if you are spending money on this, the budget. So say you're paying all your team members in a commercial setting, they're sort of managing everything. Now, in larger game studios, there is a producer as well that handles the budgeting and everything, but I'm thinking in terms of a small team here. So a project lead would typically, as well as driving the actual production of the game, they will be making concessions for time management, development cycle, and keeping other team members on task. They often work closely with the designer, or in small teams often are the designer as well. Their job is kind of hands-off from if you're just looking at the project leader role, it's quite hands-off in the game itself. They're more trying to get people to do things that will make the game happen, and managing in other things like, when we're going to be doing a beta launch and when we're doing testing, getting testers in to do that. And then, if there's publicity to do, they might have something to do with that as well on a small team. Okay, now a designer actually plans out what the game needs and what it will be when it's complete. So they're largely responsible for the development of like game mechanics and the sort of look and feel of the game. They're the guy that's sort of coming up with the concepts of what the game is. So they're going, look, it's going to be a first-person shooter, and it's got these mechanics in it. Now, this is even on a larger team. This is larger or smaller team. It doesn't matter. The job of a designer is a collaborative effort between other team members. Now, large teams will often have multiple designers handling all sorts of different aspects. You'll see gameplay designer, like level designer, things like that. On a smaller team, a designer kind of designs all that, but they're doing so with input from everyone else. Now, a designer and the project lead both need to have really good communication skills, because that's a main part of their actual job, is talking to other team members. You'll typically find the designer is often, on small teams, the one with the more experience, especially like actual game development experience. If you've got 4 people working on a game and 2 of them have worked on games before, like successful games, you'll likely find that one of those will be a really good designer for a game, because they understand how the process works. Now, a designer often sits there making design documents and making lots of changes to that design document. Again, on small teams, there's often overlap here. You typically won't have a designer, a designated designer in a team of 3 people. Your designer will also be an artist or also be a programmer. There'll be a project lead and a programmer. It depends how many people you got working on it. And basically, the more people you have working on a game, the bigger the job is for the designer and the project lead, because they've got more people to collaborate with. If there's only 3 people working on a game, a designer or a project lead will have a lot of dead time during the actual development of a game. They'll be busy in pre-production, but later on in the game cycle, they will have less to do, and that's why you typically see them having multiple roles. Okay, then you typically also have a programmer. Now, the programmer, it's pretty simple. He codes. That's what he does. He's a programmer. He does code. He basically makes it work. Now, again, small teams, you're often sharing this role, so you might have a programmer, an artist, programmer, designer. It doesn't matter. Hopefully, your games programmer will have game development experience, because games coding is quite separate to just traditional coding. There's some weird things in there that will take them some time to get used to, but they don't necessarily have to have that sort of thing. If they're a great coder, I'm sure they'll pick it up pretty quick. Coders are great. Their role is typically, if you've just got a designated programmer, it's pretty hands-off in terms of the actual game design and what's going into the game. They're kind of just coding things up that is needed by other team members. Now, it can even be things like they're coding tools up. So you'll often see like tool coding done in real big teams, even in small teams, depending on what you're doing now. They might do something like, say you are doing an engine from scratch. You're not using a pre-bought engine, you're not using Unity or anything. A programmer will be making the engine to have the things that it needs, that the designer has laid out in his design document. Now, he will also do tools for other team members. So he might make a level editor, for example. Or he might make a sort of system for importing 3D models and rigging them up so they can do animations. And he can easily reference that in code. That's a big part of a designer's job, programmer's job, if you're starting from scratch. Now, of course, there's the role of artist and sound and music design. It's very similar. They're the sort of more creative roles, I suppose you'd say. So an artist makes art, 3D or 2D art, doesn't matter. Again, small teams, you might also see a 3D artist that will be doing level design or something like that. Sound and music design, it's obvious what they do. They make sound or music, often with input from the project lead and the designer, making sounds that are specific for what they want for the sort of feel of the game, and doing things off a script as well. Okay, so in closing, main thing I'm going to say is making a game, it's not rocket science. It's not like some mythical, otherworldly task. It's like any other project, any other big involved project, commercial or not. You need people with complementary skills that work together to achieve a common goal. So I will say you do see quite a few people that want to make a game, posting on forums and the like, and they don't know how the process works, and they've never made a game before, and they go, right, I'm going to be the project lead, and I need a programmer and an artist, and we're going to make some insert type of game. But they haven't actually done any games design up for the game that they want. And that's a really crucial role. You need a game designer. A game designer designs the game. A project lead can be a game designer as well, but they you need to make sure, especially if you've got someone sharing those two roles, that they're a really good communicator and they're really good with people, because they are responsible for driving the game's development in being a project leader, and they're also responsible for creating the right sort of scope and the actual game like theory itself as a designer. They're not real complementary roles, because often a designer wants to put more and more things into a game, whereas the project lead wants to actually get the game done. So I would recommend, if you're starting out for the first time and say there's 4 people working on the game, have one person that is a project lead and say they're also the programmer. That's great, make the programmer the project lead. And say the artist is also the guy that wants to design the game. That's great, split those roles apart, because then you'll have a nice complementary balance of the designer wanting to put more things in the game and the project lead going, hang on, we don't have time for this, we're going to be finished in 6 months, we can't just start adding features now, we're going to have to like put those on the back burner, we can put them in a crunch later if we've got time, otherwise we're just plowing through now. And yeah, that's probably my main advice to anyone looking to start up making a game with their friends or people on the internet, is split those two roles apart, because they're not really complementary roles unless someone has a lot of industry experience and they know how it works. If it's your first time making a game, make sure your project lead and your designer are separate. Make sure you have both roles filled. If it is a small team, don't just give someone the role of being a project lead and that's it, because for half the game they're not going to be doing much. They're going to be going, oh, you guys finished that game yet? And they'll be like, not yet. And they'll be like, okay, but we need to hurry up. And that's it. Whereas everyone else is sitting there coding, making art, and it's like in the real busy period of making a game, they're going to be like overwhelmed with things to do, and the project lead's just going to be sort of sitting behind them cracking the whip. And another thing is, make sure that your project lead and your designer, they're going to be working closely together. Make sure they can actually get along, and make sure the whole team can get along with each other. The last thing you want is, especially if collaborating over the net, is you get halfway into a game and your project lead is a total ruthless dictator and he's totally riding the artist the entire time, and the artist just goes, look, that's it, I'm out, see ya. Because now you're left without an artist, and it was all because the project lead didn't manage the project properly. Alright guys, that's about it. There'll be another vlog up shortly regarding Project Longsword, and Just Make Game will be out later this month as well. I've made quite a lot of progress on the game so far. This month has been real good, so I'll put it up in a new vlog anyway in the next couple of days, next week or so, and you'll be able to see what I'm up to at this point. Alright guys, cheers.